In this video, I'm going to replace both of the wheel bearing and hub assemblies on the front end of my Nissan Pathfinder. I got it jacked up. I've got some jack stands under there, and obviously I've already taken off the tire. I'm going to have to remove the axle nut, the cotter pin, those sort of things. I'm going to have to do the brakes. So I got a separate brake video, so I'm not going to do the brakes. This is already going to be a long video. I'll link the brakes in another video so you can watch that if you don't know how to do the brakes. Obviously, you need to do the brakes to do this job. The dealership quoted me about $700 per wheel, so $1,400 for the whole front end, and I paid about $200 per wheel for the parts, nuts, bolts, and a couple tools that I didn't have. So overall, I saved about $1,000. So like I said, I've already taken off the brakes. I did that off camera because I already have another brake video, so you can watch that if you want. Now to get the hub and bearing assembly off, first step is to remove the cotter pin. Obviously, that's going to be in the way of the axle nut when you remove that, and the cotter pin comes out fairly easy. Now the axle nut is a little bit more difficult. I put the lug nuts back on. That doesn't really matter because I'm going to throw out this entire wheel bearing and hub assembly. Not a big deal. And then I took a crowbar and jammed it in there so I wouldn't have any movement when I'm trying to loosen this thing up. And it is a 32 mil, and you need a deep socket. So I only had a shallow socket, so definitely a must-have before you start the job. I had to walk to the parts store, unfortunately, but there you go. I got it off without too much difficulty. Now there's 4 more bolts that hold the hub assembly onto the vehicle, and one thing I'd point out, these bolts are actually supposed to be replaced every time you remove the hub assembly. I didn't know this, so I ended up reusing these bolts. But I've got them on order, so a little bit later on, once they come in, I'm going to replace them one at a time. But obviously, it's going to be off camera. So that's one thing I didn't see anyone else do in other videos that I've watched, is actually replace these bolts with new ones. Now, I don't know why, but in the Haynes manual, it says you should not reuse these bolts. And if you look in the Nissan service manual as well, which is online, it also says not to reuse these bolts. They are pretty cheap, between $5 and $7, depending on what Nissan dealership you get them at, so they're not that expensive. Anyway, it's a 17 millimeter bolt, so you're gonna need that 17 mil. They're easy to get off. I didn't have to fight with them at all because the torque spec on these is only 44 foot-pounds, so it's not like they're cranked down to 100 plus foot-pounds and then rust welded in. They're pretty easy to remove. Obviously, I use PB Blaster, and then just using a socket and a few extensions, as it'll get all 4 of those off. But like I said, when I talked to the Nissan dealer, they just recommended you get a new axle nut, but they didn't say anything about the 4 bolts that hold everything on, so that's a bit unfortunate. Anyway, once you get those 4 bolts off, that's pretty much everything holding this thing on. The first hammer I tried was a dead blow hammer, but because of the rust, it didn't get the assembly moving, so I had to go grab my 3-pound, I think it's a 3-pound sledge, and that did the trick. A few good solid hits, and it got things moving. The other thing I have is a 3-jaw puller, and I use that to push the axle back and away from the hub assembly. Now, having this puller is helpful. It's not necessary, I don't think, but it just made it a little bit easier to push the axle back in. I don't think you need it, but if you have one, obviously it might be something that comes in handy. Now, there is an electrical connector for the speed sensor, and honestly, it is the most painful thing to remove in this whole process. Definitely, most of the swearing that I did was removing the electrical connectors for the speed sensor. So I found it helpful to use a flathead screwdriver, and then I also used a pair of vice grips to hold the connector, and then use the flathead screwdriver with the other hand. Anyway, it's a pain. It is an electrical connector. If you can get everything else done, you can get the electrical connector off, but it is not the most enjoyable thing to do. Anyway, once that's off, you can just pull the hub and bearing assembly out, no problem. And now where that hub and bearing assembly mount up on the vehicle, it is fairly rusty. So I took some time with some wire brushes. I used a whole bunch of WD-40, and I just cleaned it up so that there's a flat surface so that the new assembly will mount in there nice and flat onto the metal. And after about 20 minutes of scrubbing, I got the anti-seize out, and I used anti-seize pretty much on everything fairly liberally. You know what, this vehicle has 300,000 kilometers. I don't think I'll ever have to do the wheel bearing again, so it probably isn't that big of a deal, but I used it anyway because you never know. I guess a wheel bearing could fail again, but I just don't think that's going to happen. Obviously, you need to get the shield back on the vehicle, then the bearing and hub assembly just slide on. It's very simple. And then I found putting the axle nut on and slowly tightening it down was the best first step for putting everything together. And once that was loosely in place, I did the electrical connector. And the electrical connector comes with all those rubber grommets that sort of clip into various points along the vehicle, and everything was spaced out correctly, so you didn't have to mess around with the electrical connector or those rubber grommets. Everything worked. And this new one is a Moog. Now, for the most part, these bolts are pretty easy to put back in. I go to 44 foot-pounds on these ones, and I treat it the exact same way as putting the tire back on your vehicle. So instead of going down and cranking one all the way to 44 foot-pounds, I just put one in, get it sort of tight by hand, and then I start putting the other ones in. Once everything's in and tightened by hand, I take a regular socket and tighten them down just a little bit with the socket. And then once they're all sort of snug, I take the torque wrench and then put them down to 44 foot-pounds. Now, like I said, I reuse the bolts. I've been driving it for about a week now, no issues. I haven't careened off the highway or anything like that. But I do have some bolts on order, so once those come in, I'll have to get back under the car, take the old ones off one at a time, and put the new ones on. Now, because of the size of this torque wrench I have, it's too big, and it's very difficult to operate inside of the wheel well. So I do have to turn the wheels all the way to the left and then all the way to the right to actually use my torque wrench. If you have a regular size torque wrench, it should actually be able to fit in there and function properly. So you can see I had to turn the wheel the other way as well. But it's just because this torque wrench is so big, it hits the wheel well, which is a bit of a pain. Now you can see I put the lug nuts back on, and that again is just so I don't damage the threads. And the torque spec on this is 101 foot-pounds. It's different for the rear. I think it's 177 on the rear. But again, 101 is what I used on the front. And then I got new cotter pins as well. So obviously new lug nut, new cotter pin. And then I just used some pliers and I bend it over. And then this is a dead blow hammer, so it shouldn't damage the threads because it's like a rubber hammer. And I just tap that back into place so that the cotter pin is fairly flush with the threads. Now, going to the other side of the vehicle, I've already taken the brakes off again. Once again, you can get the links in the description for the brake video if you need to look at how to get the brakes off. And I've been hitting this with PB Blaster. I did the driver's side on Saturday, and then on Sunday I came and did the passenger side. Once I did one of these things, it was actually pretty easy. As long as you could remove the bolts and the nuts, you can do this job. It's not very difficult overall. And there you go, a bent up cotter pin. I'll get that off. Just like the other side, put the crowbar in, got the lug nuts on, and then put that 32 deep socket on with the impact. And I had no issues getting this off with the impact as well. Obviously, I could have used breaker bars. And the bolts that hold the hub assembly on, once again, not that difficult to get off. I obviously did soak them in PB Blaster for an hour or two before I tried it, but overall not too bad. And just like the other side, I went with the dead blow first. It didn't do the job. I did need the 3-pound hammer. I don't think a small carpenter style hammer would do the trick, but this little 3-pounder, no issues at all. Just about a minute of smacking and it finally popped off. And just like the other side, I used this puller, and really I'm just using it to push the axle out of the hub assembly. And once the axle's loosened off, a few more smacks with the hammer and everything starts loosening up. And just like the other side, once everything was loose, I came in for the electrical connectors, and just like the other side, the electrical connector was probably the hardest part of this whole job, just because you're reaching up high and there's not a lot of room to work in there, and the plastic is very seized together. But eventually I do get it off. It just took a little bit of swearing. And just a little side note here, when you remove the brakes, just make sure you don't hang them on the brake lines. Just find a place where you can put the brakes in, and this is what the bearing sounds like. So obviously the bearing doesn't sound great, and that's sort of why I put the new ones on. Just getting a lot of wheel noise. And for cleaning up the rust on the passenger side, I use a drill, and I have a wire wheel that I eventually found in my messy garage, and that did a great job of getting the rust off. Once I was happy that the rust was free and clear, and that the bearing would mount nice and flat in the housing, I once again took anti-seize, painted it up, and got a little bit of anti-seize on the axle as well. And there's the product information for the Nissan official nut. Cotter pin was sold separately, and just like the other side, you obviously need that dust shield on first, and then you could slot the axle into the wheel bearing, and then once it's sticking through, I just found it was helpful to put the nut on first, and that way your wheel bearing doesn't fall off while you're working on other things. And just like the other side, I am going to reuse these bolts with the full knowledge that you are not supposed to reuse these bolts. So I am going to have to replace these, unfortunately, off camera at a later time. They should be in about a week. And just like the driver's side, I do all 4 of the bolts hand tight, and then I come around with a regular socket wrench, just tighten them up a little bit, and then I come around with the full-on torque wrench and torque them down to 44 foot-pounds again on this side as well. Because I'm using this massively oversized torque wrench, I can't get it in the wheel well, so I have to do a little bit of a workaround by turning the wheel one way and then turning the wheel the other way. Once the bolts are torqued down to 44 foot-pounds, I just take the wiring and mount it up on all the connection points on the vehicle, and then finally plug it in up top into the actual connector. Pretty simple overall. Like I said, getting it off, very difficult. Putting the electrical connector back on, very easy. And once again, I take the torque wrench and go to 101 foot-pounds on the axle. Again, using the crowbar to prevent everything from spinning. And then obviously I'm going to drop that new cotter pin in on this side as well, bend it over with the needle nose pliers, and then use the dead blow to flatten it out so that it's flat against the threads on the axle. And I didn't show it on the other one, but I do use some anti-seize on the hub before I put the disc brakes back on. And that's pretty much it. Like I said, there's a whole nother video for brake that you could watch. I did do this over 2 days. I would say the first one took about 2.5 hours. The second one probably took me about an hour and a half. But that's not bad for saving $1,000 Canadian. Anyway, thanks for checking out my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.